Today I'm going to talk to you about research that I've done for several years. I'm continuing it at Barnard, but also when I was a faculty member at the University of Chicago, and even before that from my dissertation. And it's really designed to ask the question of what math anxiety is, how it relates to performance, and if knowing something about math anxiety, we can help students, adults perform better in their daily lives. And I say daily lives because I think everything involves math. Math is really interesting, especially in the US, because you don't hear people walking around bragging about not being reading people, but you hear highly intelligent people walking around all the time bragging about not being math people. And what we have learned, my research team and I, is that part of the reason people talk about this and avoid it and are nervous about it, as Ursula talked about, is that they have math anxiety. Now, it used to be that most researchers who study psychology, cognitive science, and education thought that math anxiety was something that happened in middle school or high school when math became more hard. But in my work, especially talking to a lot of teachers, even in elementary school and early elementary school, we kept on hearing that they were noticing signs of math anxiety in their young children and in their kids. And so my research team actually set out to ask the question of whether there was evidence of math anxiety at the start of formal schooling. And this was the first time that anyone had asked this because everyone just assumed that math anxiety didn't develop till much later. And so we were really interested in a couple things. One was, could we find evidence that some kids were nervous about math? Was overall this math anxiety more than for like other subjects like reading? And was there some evidence that there were gender differences? We know that girls overall or women overall tend to be more anxious about math than men, at least in the US. And so were we seeing these gender differences early on? And if so, why? So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides with you now and actually show you some of what we did. Okay, so I mentioned to you that we were really interested in this case of young kids, but because no one had looked at math anxiety in this age group before, we actually had to develop a way to assess it. We went in to look at first and second graders in a large public Midwestern school district, and we developed basically a questionnaire and a game to ask kids if they were anxious about math. So kids were brought out one-on-one with an experimenter who was a student, a college student or a research assistant, and asked questions like this. How do you feel when you take a big test in your math class? Or how do you feel when you get a textbook and there's numbers in it, and or you get your math book and you see all the numbers in it? And kids would point to either a very smiley face or a really, really frowny face. And we talked to them before they did these sorts of questions and pointed to the faces just about things that one might be nervous about, looking out from a tall building or something that someone might be really excited about, getting ice cream. And so we got them used to doing these sorts of things, and we asked them these questions, both for math, and then we also had a similar questionnaire around reading. That was really pretty similar. How do you feel when you have to take a reading test or you get a reading book and you see all the words in it? So we really worked to make these scales really similar. What we found was that overall, children in first and second grade had more anxiety about math than reading. And that some kids did have math anxiety, right? And what we see is really a normal distribution. So the data I'm going to show you is a study with about 200 children in it. And what you're going to see, it's a histogram. And what you see is that on the y-axis frequency, so number of kids, and on the x-axis, we've grouped the faces by really anxious, moderately anxious, and not anxious at all. And what you see is a normal distribution. Some kids report being anxious about math, and some kids are not anxious about math. Overall, kids have a medium amount of anxiety about math, but the really interesting thing here was, first of all, that they had math anxiety to begin with. Now, if some kids are anxious about math, and we know that they tended to have more math anxiety on average than reading anxiety, one question is, does this anxiety about math relate to their math performance? So in a separate session, working with kids again one-on-one, we pulled them out of class and we had them do math achievement measures, really math games. So they might be asked questions like, how many squares are there? Or if you have 7 pennies and you spend 3, how many pennies would you have left? And our question was, are kids who are more anxious doing worse in math or achieving less in math? And the answer was yes. The more math anxiety a child had, the worse they were achieving or performing on these sorts of math problems. And that more math anxiety a child had did not relate to their reading level or how well they were reading. So now we have this specific anxiety that's predicting their math performance. Of course, we don't have causality, right? We don't know whether if kids are struggling in math, they develop anxiety, or whether being anxious about math leads them to struggle, right? So there's a question about which way it goes. And it's really hard to get at this causality issue because we're not assigning some kids to be anxious about math. We're in classrooms asking these questions. And so one thing we actually did was step back for a second and say, well, if we have some kids who are anxious about math, where could this anxiety come from, right? Where are they picking it up? Now, kids are anxious and kids get information about anxiety, what they should feel good about, what they should feel bad about in all different parts of their life. But one place that we were particularly interested in looking is around where they actually got a lot of the math input, and that's in the classroom. We know that oftentimes, at least in the US, parents think that math is the purview of the classroom. They don't do bedtime math, they do bedtime reading, although we think they should do bedtime math because we've shown that it actually enhances their performance. But we know that a lot of parents think, oh, math is something you learn at school. And so we asked the question about whether having teachers in the classroom in first and second grade who might be anxious about their own math ability could actually relate to how kids were anxious and how they were performing in math across the school year. We asked this question as well because we know that in the US, upwards of 90% of early elementary school teachers are women. This is a really interesting statistic because it suggests that if teachers, on average, early in elementary school have some anxiety about math, and they're all women, and we know that kids at this age tend to glom on and mimic same gender adults, could there be a transfer of the anxiety from teacher to student? And not because the teacher wants to transfer it, maybe they're possibly, part of the reason is they're not equipped to teach in the classroom, they haven't been given the right support structures. But we did want to know whether something about the teachers and the anxiety that they might be feeling could be translated in this way. And we didn't come up on this on our own. There had been several meta-analyses, so a pulling together of a lot of data of which college majors were most anxious about math across hundreds of universities. The first meta-analysis is data I'm going to show you from the 90s, but it's been replicated even as recently as last year from my lab. And what we see is that college students who are majoring in early education tend to have more anxiety about math than other college majors. So to us, this suggested that potentially if teachers are somewhat anxious in the classroom, this could actually rub off and impact what kids feel about math and how they learn. So we went to test this. We looked at about 20 or so teachers and 100 and some odd students. We assessed teachers' math anxiety and also their math knowledge for teaching. These were first and second grade teachers because we wanted to know about their anxiety independent of their ability to communicate and teach math. And what we did is we measured the math performance and math achievement of their students both at the beginning and the end of the school year. Now, at the beginning of the school year, because kids are randomly assigned to classrooms in this large school district we are looking at, we didn't expect to find any relationship between a teacher's math anxiety and her students' math achievement. We only used female teachers here. But by the end of the school year, if there was some possibility that a teacher's anxiety had an impact on their child, on the student's math achievement, then you would expect a relationship between a teacher's math anxiety and students' math achievement to be there at the end of the school year. And if the students are paying attention to same-sex adults, given that we used all female teachers, you'd expect that relationship to be stronger in the girl students relative to the boy students. So we did this study with about 20 teachers and 100 so odd students, and we found that the more math anxiety a teacher had, there was no impact on performance at the beginning of the year because the students had just been in the classroom, but by school year's end, the more math anxiety teachers had, the less students had achieved over the course of the school year in math. And we found that it was strongest in girls relative to boys. So I'm going to show you some data now. So this is the grade change across the school year. So this is how much students grew in their math knowledge across the school year. And what you can see are the red bars are students who were in classrooms with teachers who were really anxious about math. And the blue bars are students who were in classrooms with teachers who were lower in anxiety about math. And we have girls on the left and boys on the right. And what you can see across both is that students are learning less in classrooms where the teachers are more anxious. And this is controlling for math teachers' knowledge in terms of teaching math. They're learning less, and that the impact is bigger in the girls than the boys. Now, if this is the case, you might hypothesize that there's something changing about girls' attitudes or anxieties about who should do math and who is good at math. Because if they're seeing examples of women in the classroom, but outside, it's not just teachers who could have this anxiety, then you should actually be able to see some change in how girls think about who is good at math. And it's hard, as you know, to get anything like this out of a first grader. So we borrowed from another researcher and developed a game where we could assess children's gender stereotypes. So we asked kids to play a game with us at the beginning and the end of the school year, where we told them a story about a kid who is good at math and a kid who is good at reading, and we asked them to draw the kids. And what we're interested in is whether, especially girls who are in classrooms with math anxious teachers, by the end of the school year were more likely to draw girls at being good at reading and boys at being good at math. So stereotypic ideas about gender and who is good at what. So at the beginning of the school year, we did this, and there was no relationship between a teacher's math anxiety and whether her students drew girls at being good at math and boys at being good at reading, or vice versa. But by the end of the school year, what we showed is for classrooms where teachers were really most math anxious, the girls were more likely than in classrooms where the teachers weren't as anxious to draw a girl as being good at reading and a boy as being good at math. So a stereotypical endorsement of who is good at what. And we showed that when girls drew the stereotypical endorsement, they tended to perform lower in math. So here's an example of one of the drawings. So on the left, you can see this is a girl that they drew as good at reading. If we do a sort of a funneled debriefing, and if we couldn't figure out what the gender is, we'd ask them. This is sort of an egghead, drawing, but she said it was a boy. And so now we're seeing some evidence that when you're in classrooms with teachers who are anxious about math, girls especially are more likely to endorse the stereotype that boys are better at math and they perform worse in math across the school year. Now, these are first grade classrooms, right? So you could imagine some of this just being exemplified over time. And I'll say that it's certainly not just in the classroom. We also know that when parents who are anxious about math help their kids with homework, oftentimes they say things like, it's okay, I'm not good at math either. And the parents that tend to help the kids with homework tend to be the women on average. And so they're getting this endorsement in other places. But I will say that we weren't satisfied with these results because our sample still was not that big. So we went out and did the whole study again with over 60 teachers and over 600 students. Again, across the school year, assessing teachers' anxiety, assessing students' achievement at the beginning and the end of the school year. And with this really large sample, we again found this impact of teachers' math anxiety related to kids' achievement at the end of the school year. But we also showed that it wasn't just in girls, it was there in boys too. So this is spring math performance. We always account for fall math performance. Spring math performance is on the y-axis here. And what, again, we showed was that the lighter bars are students who are in classroom with teachers who are more math anxious, they're performing worse than in classrooms with teachers who are less math anxious in terms of math across the school year. It's there for both boys and girls. It's bigger in girls. The effect is bigger in girls, but it's there in both. So again, we're starting to see this relationship between a teacher's math anxiety controlling for her math ability to teach, her math achievement, and how kids are learning across the school year. Now, of course, we still don't have a causal mechanism here. We don't know how teachers are transferring this anxiety to students, and we don't actually, and how it affects their performance. And we don't actually know how anxiety changes how people think and perform, whether you're kids or adults. So in a lot of my work, we use converging evidence. We don't just look at, one measure of performance. We try and get at questions in multiple ways. And here, our next step was actually to go out of the classroom and go inside the head and actually take a look at what happens in the brain when teachers or people who are anxious about doing math. Is it something about actually doing the math? Can we see evidence in the brain that maybe they're not as good at math? Or is it something about the anxiety itself that changes how you perform? And that's really important, because if it's about the anxiety itself, it suggests that we need in the classroom and outside the classroom to be thinking about targeting anxiety, not just how people are teaching or learning. And for many years, the lore was, if you're performing poorly in math, that's why you're anxious about it. But we've really argued, my research team has argued, no, the anxiety in itself can change how the brain performs. That can lead to less learning, and that's really important in itself. It suggests we have to target and think about how we're addressing the anxiety in addition to how we teach math across the years. So it's really hard to figure out to separate the anxiety and the performance in the classroom. But you can do that using neuroscientific techniques, and that's exactly what we've done. We use a technique in my lab called fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. So this is a picture of an MRI. I'm sure some of you have seen these before. An MRI is just a big magnet, and all it does is measure the magnetic properties of whatever's inside it. That's all it is. So some of you might have an MRI on a knee or a shoulder to see if a ligament's torn. And because different types of tissue have different magnetic properties, you can get a really nice picture of whether there's a torn ligament. But with a slight tweak in that technology, that's the functional, not only can you get a picture of the structure, but you can actually infer function. And this is what we use fMRI for, to look at people's heads, basically to peer inside without actually opening their head. So we can get a great picture of what the brain looks like, its structure, but we can also infer how the brain is working, because this big magnet, which is generally 50 to 100,000 times stronger than the Earth's magnetic field, can pick up on changes in magnetic properties in the brain. And in this case, whenever a different area of the brain or areas of the brain are working the hardest, their neurons or the brain cells need nutrients. They need oxygen, they need glucose. And the way that all those nutrients get to the different parts of the brain is by the blood sending them there. And when the blood is sending all those nutrients to different parts of the brain, it has different magnetic properties than when it's not. You can pick up on that, and you can infer which brain areas are working the hardest at a particular point in time. Now, this is really interesting because we can use this to ask questions. When people who are anxious all of a sudden are put in a brain scanner and have to do math, are they activating areas of the brain that are involved, that we know are involved in number processing? Or are they activating areas of the brain that we know are involved in anxiety? Or both? And this can give us a really interesting picture of what's going on. So we invited people to our lab to have their brain scan. We didn't tell them it was about math, because one thing we know about math that Ursula mentioned is that oftentimes when students are anxious, they want to hide, they want to run away about it. So we didn't want people to not want to come. We knew whether people were anxious about math or not beforehand, because we had them do some surveys and some other tasks. We invited them. They got to the lab, we said, surprise, we'd like to put you in this brain scanner. While you're doing that, you're going to see a computer screen in front of you, and we're going to have you do a math test. Now, no one ran away screaming. They all were willing to do it. So they lie on their back, and basically here it's measuring the magnetic properties of your head, right? So we're going to get a picture of the structure of the brain, but we're also going to be able to infer which areas of the brain are asking for the most resources, and that's the functioning of the brain. Now, we did something kind of clever, and I think I can say it's clever because I didn't come up with it. One of my graduate students came up with it. But what we were able to do is not just measure what was happening when people did math problems, but just when they knew the math was coming. And this is really interesting because if you see differences between people who are really worried about math and people who aren't, when they just know the math is coming, those brain differences can't have anything to do with actually performing the math because they haven't performed the math yet, right? And so we separated out the reaction to knowing the math was coming to when they actually did the math, and we asked questions about how the brain looked different. So here's what we did. They're lying in the scanner. There's a screen that comes down in front of them. They have a little button box. They're going to take like a test. And we had them perform both word problems and math problems that were sort of matched for difficulty. And what they were told was every time they saw a yellow square, a math problem was going to appear. And every time they saw a white square, a word problem was going to appear. So the math problem, you have to tell us whether 4 times 8 minus 15 equals 19. Is that true or false? What's the answer? Is that valid? I can only see Ursula, so I'll ask her to answer. It's stressful to have to do
false,
this.
Sorry, I was looking for you. False.
And then the other one, the word test you had to do is, the question is, if the letters are spelled backwards, does it spell a real word?
Yes.
No, it's close, but it doesn't. We almost get to experiment, but it doesn't. This is psychologist's idea of a joke, right? Really funny for like trying to mess with you. So every time a yellow square came, they knew they were going to get a math problem. And every time the white square came, they knew they were going to get the word problem. And what we are really interested in is how the brains of people who are math anxious look different from people who are less anxious about math, just when they know the math problem is coming, right? And we're always comparing it to the word test, so it's kind of like a baseline. And we showed something really interesting. We showed that just when the people who are anxious about math knew it was coming, they activated areas of their brain that were involved in their neural pain response. It's the same areas of the brain that are active when you prick your finger with a needle or stub your toe. When some people say math is painful, their brain is actually showing signs of this. And we found that the people who are anxious about math activated these neural pain response regions more. And when they actually went to do the math, it sort of shut down their ability to concentrate and focus. So almost as if the anxiety itself was impacting the rest of the brain and their ability to perform. So this is actually what the scans look like. And let me just orient you. On the top, if this is my brain, you're just taking off the left hemisphere and you're looking in medially at an area called the mid-cingulate cortex. And on the bottom, if this is my brain, you're standing behind me, you've sliced off the top of my head, you're peering over bilaterally on both sides at an area called the posterior insula. And what we showed is that these two areas and a whole other network of areas were more active in people who are anxious about math relative to not. And why we think these areas are interesting is because, as I said before, they're sort of involved in our neural alarm signals, our ideas about pain. So just knowing math is coming activated these areas. And then when people who are activated these areas, when they actually did the math, they didn't show as much activation in this front part of their brain that we know is important for focusing and concentrating on what you're doing. So it's as if the math, that worrying about the anxiety itself, changed how they performed. Now, this is really interesting because, again, it starts to be another piece of evidence that there's something about anxiety itself that can change how you're prepared to learn and perform. It's not just that you perform poorly in math and then you're anxious about it, but the anxiety is causal in some way. Now, how does this anxiety actually change how you perform? It can certainly change your concentration and your ability to focus, but we've also shown that it actually changes how you practice. So one of my PhD students for her dissertation looked at students in AP calculus at a large Midwestern high school and looked at how anxious they were and looked how they studied for the AP Calc exam. And what she showed is that everyone said that doing practice problems was much more difficult than just reading the book, right? So everyone kind of knew that that was the best way to study. But people who were anxious about math tended to be more likely to do easier practice problems when they were studying, and they didn't perform as well on the AP test because of it. So this is work by one of my postdoc here at Barnard, which I'm excited about, Jaleisha Jennifer. And on the x-axis here, you have math anxiety. So 1 is the least math anxious and 5 is most math anxious. And on the y-axis, it's how students prioritize solving problems when they were studying for the AP Calc exam. So what we show is this negative correlation. The more math anxiety you have, the more likely students were to prioritize studying the easier problems relative to the hard problems. It's almost as if they were avoiding the math. And if you don't study the right way, you're actually not going to perform as well. And this is exactly what we showed. So again, math anxiety isn't just the same thing as not being able to achieve in math. There's something about the anxiety itself that changes how you approach studying, but also changes how you think about performing. And we've shown this because when students are anxious about math, they worry. They worry about the situation, they worry about the consequences, and we've asked them what they're thinking about people who are really worried about math. And here are some of the things they say. I hope I don't look stupid. I thought about how boys are usually better than girls at math, so I was worried about not making mistakes. These are high school and college students. There's no way I'm going to perform well, right? So students who are anxious about math are having these sort of verbal ruminations. What do we want to do when we're anxious? We don't want to do things. We want to move away from it. So even students in AP Calculus who are anxious about math tended to avoid the harder problems. And these worries in itself we've shown from the neuroimaging data, we think suggests that people don't have as much attention to devote to what's going on. So what do you do about it? Well, of course, there's not one end-all be-all, but I did want to end by showing you one intervention study that we've done at a large high school that didn't look specifically at math anxiety, but looked at worries students have, not because they're anxious about math, but because they were anxious about confirming that their group identity wasn't as smart or wasn't as good as other students. And we went in to look at this issue specifically because a large high school had come in and asked us to really assess a problem they were having. They were a feeder school from a middle school that was in a wealthier area and a middle school that was in more of a low income area. And what they were showing is that the way they tracked kids into the advanced science classes was perpetuating gaps that had occurred from these students coming in from the different middle schools. And they wanted to know whether or not they could actually help ensure that students who had the aptitude and interest were getting into the appropriate science classes. And they hypothesized and asked us whether or not there could be something about students worrying about their identity being from a more low-income background that could actually change how they were performing in their classes. And this is pretty similar to students worrying about math. It's just a different worry in general. And we know that what you worry about is a product of the environment you're in. If I walk into a room with all men, I might worry about the fact that I'm the only woman in the room and what they'll think about me if we're talking about math or finance. I might feel very differently if I walk into a room that has a different makeup of people. So we went into this large high school over 2 years, and we asked whether or not simply doing an intervention we knew that could potentially alleviate some of the anxiety these students felt would help them perform better on important standardized tests. This was first years, freshmen in high school, and everyone took biology. They took biology from different teachers, but the same curriculum. And at the end of the fall semester and at the end of the spring semester, they had a standardized biology test that the high school gave them. And this standardized test was used to determine the different science tracks that students would go on. And what they were showing is that students from the lower income middle school were passing the test at a much lower rate than the students who were coming from the higher income middle school. And the question was, why? Is it something about their preparedness? Is it something about the achievement? Or is there something about the anxiety itself that actually was changing how they performed? So we didn't attack the preparedness or achievement angle. We did attack the anxiety angle. And right before students took their fall exam and their spring exam, we randomly assigned students to either a control condition where they just spent some more time preparing to take the exam, or an intervention condition where we actually had them reappraise their anxiety as they went into this important test. So basically, they read an article about the fact that a sweaty palms and beating heart isn't a sign you're about to fall on your face. It's actually a sign that your heart is shunting important resources to your brain so you can think. And they were asked to reappraise their physiological feelings. Maybe this isn't a sign I'm going to do poorly. Maybe it's a sign I'm ready to go. And they wrote about those feelings. So some students did that. That was our intervention to attack the anxiety. And other students just got ready for the exam. And it was about 10 minutes they had to do this right before they went into their exams in the fall and spring semester. So this is a big study, over 1,000 students. The school year began. We had them do this fall semester writing exercise right before the exams. They took their final exam. We had them do it again in the spring. They took their spring exam, and then the school year ended. Again, some students were randomly assigned to this control condition to just spend an extra 10 minutes studying for the test, and other students were asked to do these exercises to reappraise their thoughts and anxiety. What we found was that for students who were higher income, coming from the higher income areas, there was no real impact of doing these exercises. But for students who came from the lower income, who identified as lower income, doing these exercises actually increased their performance on the test by about 4 percentage points. And for many, it was the difference between failing and passing the test. So I'm going to show you the data here. So if you look on the left-hand graph, exam performance is on the y-axis. There's an achievement gap between lower and higher income students. This is an achievement gap that we know is there actually at the start of formal schooling. What you see is that the lower income students who are part of our intervention, these writing exercises, perform better on the exam than the lower income students who are not. It's not out of this world. We didn't change them from 60 to 90%, but we did adjust their performance just from doing these interventions. Where this becomes really meaningful is if you look on the right-hand graph, this translates into who passes the course. And what you can see is that we were able to markedly change the number of low-income students passing the course and actually able to go on because of these because of these exercises in their science classes. An interesting story is when we worked with the school on these findings after a couple of years, they actually changed how they did this entire science testing and into the next tracks, because they were showing right away that we thought some of the reason lower income students weren't passing was because of their anxiety about whether they could do it. And the school went to basically a different way to think about how to offer students opportunities for additional science classes, which I'm going to consider a success in all of this. So I've shown you a lot of data, but I'm excited about it and excited to talk to you about it. Basically, we started with this idea that math anxiety and anxiety about performance is something that can start really young, that there's evidence that some of the anxiety that kids have is transferred from teachers to students. We also know parents to students. It comes from somewhere. That it's not just that being bad at something leads you to be anxious, but when you're anxious about it, it actually changes how the brain functions. It means you learn less, it means you study differently, and it means you perform differently. And that there are interventions, simple techniques, brief techniques that we can use to help change some of that performance. And, if you take anything away from this work, I think what I hope you take away, and I'm guessing I'm preaching to the choir and to some extent, is that anxiety and attitudes are critical, right? It's not just about what we're teaching our students, that this starts early, and that really to ensure that our students are able to perform up to their potential, especially students who come in with the weight of worries about how they should perform because of their gender group, social group, socioeconomic group, that focusing on both what students learn and how they feel is really key to successful performance. So I'll stop there. I haven't been reading any of the comments because I'm trying not to dual task. So I'm excited to see where we're going here. If you want to learn more about some of this work, I have a TED Talk you can go watch. I have 2 books on this work, and you can follow me on all the social media. And here are some of our funders, and I'm very thankful for their support for all this work. So I'm going to stop and then sharing, and then I'll open it up from there.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Leah, who's going to help us facilitate this Q&A. As a reminder, you can use the raised hand option to ask your question over video, or you can ask your question in the chat.
Thanks, Jen. That was an incredible talk, Dr. Beilock. I do want to encourage people to raise their hand and get some live questions asked. Jen and I have been watching the chat for you, Dr. Beilock. So we do have—
What have they been saying?
It's incredibly active. People are sending each other research and articles and telling them to read this. It's pretty cool. I think let's start going kind of backwards in the questions, because you just showed that data on the lower income versus the higher income students. And one of our teachers, Brooke, was wondering if there was a racial breakdown.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we did look at race, splitting the data just by race here, and we see hints of the same effect, but our biggest effects were as a function of income. And so this is a huge, I don't know where Brooke is because I can't see her, but this is such a huge and interesting question. I encourage you to read the PNAS paper, and all of my papers are on my website. You can go to sianbeilock.com, or you can look on the Barnard website on the president's page. But it really forced us to think about when people are going to feel different aspects of their identity, right? When it's going to be relevant. And really what the conclusion we came to, and we went in to look at socioeconomic status because a school was really having issues with helping, they were reporting, at least anecdotally, they felt like lower income students were underperforming relative to their potential. And the school was so interesting because of the 2 feeder schools that came in. Socioeconomic status and race were somewhat overlapping, but not completely. But it was so interesting because it seemed to be a huge divide in the environment in general. It was clear where you come from. And so for us, the idea is like different factors can be salient in different environments. If you are a young Black student and everyone around you is white, I would imagine socioeconomic status is not as salient as race, right? Or gender is salient in particular situations. And so I think, I would expect some of this to play out dependent on what the environment is. And we talk about this sort of evaluative apprehension. Anytime you get in a situation where you're worried you're going to be judged based on some historical data about your social group or stereotypes about your social group, that's when this tends to kick in. And anytime you're worried about being judged based on some sort of hierarchical information, this kicks in the same way. So even though we really were focused on socioeconomic status and that was so salient here, I think it could play out in a lot of different ways.
Thank you. That makes so much sense. Brian Cohen, you have a raised hand. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thanks so much. And also thank you for coming on. I'm super duper fascinated by this, and just full disclosure, I decided to delay my birthday party tonight so I could be on this lecture because I'm
Oh my God, that's so much pressure.
So, oh my God, sorry. I don't mean to impact any parts of your brain. So my big question here is I teach high school math, but I work in a 6 through 12, and I'm wondering what interventions, like the one you just suggested of like the 10-minute check-in a few times a year, what interventions could we create in every grade level in every math class so eventually by the time they're in 11th and 12th grade, maybe they've learned how to deal with their math anxiety so well they do it on their own? Yeah,
no, it's a great question. And I think that, some of these interventions can be kicked in much earlier, right? Some of the writing interventions that we talked about could be done much earlier. But I think, the reappraisal work, like where you're kind of reminding students that these like physiological symptoms aren't a sign they're about to choke, is actually a very powerful one, right? And so actually for even 6th grade, like having them read, and you can look in our paper what we use, but there's, students are smart, right? And so they don't believe what you say, but having them read a little research article that reminds them that how they're feeling is not some sign that they're going to perform poorly. It's actually the opposite. That can be very powerful. And some of that can be done earlier. So I don't think there's any magical age. We've done different writing exercises where students sort of write about their thoughts and feelings and reevaluate. And when you do that, it's kind of like you end up writing about your worries, and then at the end, we sort of ask them to sort of think about why it's not as bad as they thought it was. It's kind of like that really mean email you write someone that you don't send, right? But you kind of get perspective. And that's actually been, we found that to be helpful as well, especially for students who are anxious about math. Like, oh my God, this is going to show I really suck. I can't do it. But oh wait, math is something I can learn, right? You actually get better with practice. And the kid sitting next to me is really good, but it's not because they are a math genius. There's actually no such thing as that. It's because they've done a lot more math, right? And so really hammering home this sort of mindset idea that, getting better is part of doing this. And just because you're not succeeding at this or don't get it right away is not a sign that you don't have it, right? The sort of math brilliance idea that you have it or don't, as I'm sure I'm telling you that, like really does it persever. I mean, I see it with my Barnard women who are at the top of everything, right? It's such an important point to push against.
Thanks. Brooke, you have your hand raised. Let's take another question from you.
And happy birthday, Brian.
Happy birthday, Brian. I have two young kids myself. They're 10 and 7. And so I'm constantly, two young girls. So I'm constantly dealing with this myself. But a lot of my parent friends always ask me for resources or tools to help combat math anxiety in their kids. Do you have any recommendations for things along those lines?
Yeah, so I didn't present the research tonight, but we have a science paper on bedtime math, which is
that's an awesome book.
Yeah, and there's an app. It's free on iTunes and Android, and it's basically math problems that parents can do with kids, right? So it goes from like pre-K all the way up to 4th or 5th grade. And the idea is that it gets parents talking about math with kids. And what we've done work on 1st and 2nd graders, is shown that across the school year, there's really an impact for the kids in terms of math achievement of the parents that are most anxious, right? So if you're not anxious about math, the app is great, but it doesn't necessarily do much. But if you're anxious about math, doing bedtime math, even a couple of times a month, can boost kids' performance. And we show that it doesn't change parents' math anxiety. Like we thought maybe we make parents less anxious, but what it does is change their confidence their kids can do it. And that's actually really important. And we think that it's sort of probably changing the dialogue parents have with kids outside of whenever. You don't have to do it at bedtime. I did it with my daughter anytime we go out to eat, like waiting for the food. That's when we would do it. And it's just like fun story problems. And the idea here is that it's about a dialogue around math, which can happen anywhere, right? It happens with puzzles. It can happen when you're baking. It can happen when you're driving somewhere or going on the subway. It's about putting numbers and things into your vernacular, and it's all the time. And it's something that we know that parents who are anxious stay away from.
Indeed. So many of our teachers are leaders of professional development and coaches in their school. So Sophie and Melissa Singer both had a similar question. Just what are the implications of this research for the elementary school teacher training and for professional development? Yeah,
I mean, I think the elementary school teacher training, and I would say even more so now, like I think that we're seeing all this research coming out showing, or stats coming out showing that students are less likely to select into teacher training programs now after the pandemic. I think the implications are really strong. I mean, when our first paper came out on the teacher math anxiety, I had a couple faculty at universities email me and say that there was actually pressure from their administration to change the math requirements for elementary ed because they're trying to get students to enroll, and students weren't enrolling in programs where there are a lot of math requirements, right? And so it's almost as if for elementary, and on average, it's not everyone, you're self-selecting in a population of teachers who want to stay away from math, right? And that's problematic, right? But it seems very normal if you know that people who are anxious want to stay away from it. So I think it's all about the professional development. I mean, I think it's about making sure that our elementary school teachers have that support, whether in terms of their own professional development, or I'm a big fan of math specialists, but we know that math specialists tend to be in more resource school districts, which, you know, increases income gaps. But I'm a big fan of students seeing other people in the classroom who feel really confident and good about math. And I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I think there's got to be some combination of the professional development for the teachers as well as specialist support.
Definitely. Heather, I see your hand raised. You can go ahead and unmute yourself. Nice to see you.
Hi, sorry, I don't know why it took me so long to unmute. I actually saw your talk last fall at Columbia. Was incredibly inspired by it because I was thinking about how women who are good at math just like are encouraged to teach high school, and who are, and there was something mentioned about like historically women who were good at math, a great job was to be an elementary school teacher, right? Like it was, and now there are so many more opportunities for women to do these, you know, more advanced careers, which is great. It just means there are fewer women who are amazing at math doing lower, like younger elementary school education. And I have 2 young daughters, and I would love to transition myself to elementary school at some point. Just like, again, in a huge part because of your talk. So I was curious if you were, if you had thoughts about recruitment as like a, you know, as an alternative to training. And I know you just talked about training, but
yeah. No, I mean, I think you're right? So a generation or 2 ago, women who excelled in math, elementary school teaching was one of, you know, the really high level places you went, and it's not anymore, right? So I think it starts in college. It starts with education programs. And I think it starts with incentives. And part of that has to be monetary incentives, right? Scholarships or other things, loan repayment. It's got to be an attractive profession. And, you know, this is a society issue, right? A US society issue. It's not an everywhere society issue. But I think, you know, it's clearly such a difficult profession. I have such awe and respect for all of you. But there are real policy issues here. And it's, you know, you look at where the US is scoring in math in general relative to our global countries, like globally, we're not doing so well. And I always worry that there's just not enough attention at those lower levels, where we always talk about pipeline programs, but everyone's talking about high schools. Like, we're missing a whole population of kids who could have been amazing in this area who've already been selected out. And I think, you know, I wrote an op-ed for Inside Higher Education, really focused on college and university presidents, that I think higher education institutions have a real responsibility right now to be connecting with K through 12 and especially elementary school, because especially as the pandemic has reared on, you know, 10 years from now, these are the students that are going to be, hopefully, students that we're trying to recruit. And there's a huge push everywhere to diversify the professor ranks, to diversify the most elite schools. And we're going to be in a really bad place if we have already selected out all these students who could have been amazing. And so I think one way to do it is actually to think about partnerships between colleges and universities and young kids in those areas. And at Barnard, we're doing that. We're partnering with local schools. If anyone's interested, let me know. In terms of supporting teachers, but also in terms of having our young women in STEM working with young students at those schools. Because seeing is believing here, and role models matter.
Thank you. Yeah, it's certainly a part of our mission at Math for America as well, to make this profession more enticing. Nancy, hi, you're in a car. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, hi. One is this is very interesting to me. I've been very passionate about math anxiety for a while now, and I'm actually doing my dissertation on how to lower math anxiety in elementary school teachers. But I'm also very curious about how it does start young, but it really starts in any area, any age range. And so, like, have you looked at anything about undergraduate and graduate students? Because some of the research I've seen is that, you know, women and people of color are going into STEM, but not necessarily staying there, and how that's related, and if it's related to math anxiety or not, or just how that's related.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. And certainly by showing that math anxiety can start early, I don't mean that it does for everyone, right? And so at each successive stage of the pipeline, women tend to be not continuing on at a higher rate. And also, as you mentioned, people of color. I think there's so many reasons that go into this. I think it's a big one. I'll talk about a level I know at the college and university professor level. I mean, the pandemic has been completely at odds with having a scientific research career, if you're, and especially if you're dealing with kids, right? And so I think that there's a lot of work to be done at every level, but I would argue that college can actually be a place to turn it around, right? We have at Barnard 35% of our students are STEM majors, and we spend a lot of time attacking these stereotypes head on. Everyone at Barnard has to take classes where they think empirically with data, so they can't get out of it. Our faculty decided that this is a requirement. Everyone has to do this sort of class, whether you're going to be English or chemistry, just like everyone has to take an intense year of writing. And so our Barnard women come out as amazing writers and also computationally savvy. And so I think there are opportunities to change that. I can't tell you how many students I've talked to, maybe I'm talking to a self-selected group, I'm willing to admit that, who have said that some of the classes that they were required to take where they had to think computationally changed their ideas about whether they could do math, right? And whether they were math people. And so I think at all levels, it's thinking about how you set up scenarios where it's just not so easy to go to step back, because it's a very understandable reaction that when you're worried about something, you know, I love what Ursula said, you hide, right? And we know that people push away. And so if we're setting up structures where you can avoid all math, then that just perpetuates your ideas that it's not for you.
Yep. Andrea, hi. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you so much. My question, I have two questions. One is related to dyscalculia and like learning disabilities. Like, how do you like screen that out? Is it because they have IEPs, or like, because I think of so many kids that sometimes it's hard to tell if it's the math anxiety or if it's actually a learning disability that's been masked over time, because I teach at the high school level. And then my second question is in terms of like evaluating students at the elementary or younger level. I think that there's a lot of focus on the arithmetic aspect of mathematics, and are there tasks that, like, you know, like pattern recognition with like colors or something, right? Like where you ask them to predict what's next, kind of thing. Like, are there non-numeric tasks as well? Because I like that, like sort of like identify that maybe, you know, when you don't see it as a math problem, that it's not actually like
Anxiety
provoking. Sort of tied to the question that I have.
You know, that's what a lot of students say about taking stats class. Like when they actually see the stats in a way that's more of a story or trying to explain something rather than just numerical, it kind of takes some of the anxiety off. Although if you don't see it in that way, stats can be very anxiety provoking for students. But yeah, I mean, I actually think showing students that so many things they do are math, whether it's pattern recognition or putting shapes together, right? All sorts of things that are math sort of helps them understand that they actually can do it, And I think it's a narrating a story, right? Whether it's calendar time, I mean, anything. One thing that my researchers have, and my team has shown, is that teachers at the early elementary school level who are anxious about math tend to just do less math in class as well, right? So you only do math during math time, but you could have math in all aspects of your day. Like math could be part of snack or story time or all these other places. And I think infusing math throughout the day is a really powerful way to sort of take off the anxiety and worry about it. And that's one thing that we've shown, is that teachers who are anxious just spend more time talking about numbers outside of math time. And then your other question about dyscalculia and other sort of math learning issues that could play a role. I mean, first of all, I think it's not an either or. Like, it could be that, you do have trouble grasping some numerosity or other things, and that does lead to having more anxiety, and that could certainly be masked. So I guess I would argue that, there's important elements in addressing both the anxiety and the underlying problem that a student might be having.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we're going to have one more question out of the chat, just to let you know, you've been incredibly generous with your time this evening. So there were a couple of teachers, both Jerry and Adam, were wondering, is this math anxiety research specific to America? Is this an American phenomenon? Is there research in other countries? How does it kind of translate across the globe?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have a paper that looked at the PISA data, which I'm sure everyone knows what that is, but it's an international assessment done on 15 and 17-year-olds. And we do show that there's math anxiety. It's not just the United States, but there are certainly countries that do not have it in the same way. And one thing that we've shown is, or not my research, but others have shown, is that especially certain Asian countries, East Asian countries that teach math very differently, that are not as dogmatic with how they teach math. It's not like all calculations, it's not right and wrong, and they actually explore wrong answers. That can be a really effective way to reduce the anxiety and for students to be less math anxious and actually perform better. And one of the issues is that, I suspect that very early on, math is one of the first subjects where you learn right and wrong, at least in the US system. And that's very scary, right? And so actually exploring wrong answers, oftentimes a wrong answer is based on a right principle and not sort of demanding, this sort of drill and kill kind of procedures can be really helpful for getting rid of some of that anxiety. I love wrong answers. And I love letting students struggle. Right? I mean, we know that when oftentimes people, we want to help our kids. I mean, I do this with my own, I'm speaking just from my own experience, but there's research on this, that it's very easy to want to get in there and not let a kid struggle, right? And that struggle can be really productive in some sense, for at least a bit, to let them try and figure out different ways to do something and help them connect. And when you don't let them struggle in this way, research has shown that, it sort of sends a signal that they can't do it.
Thank you so much. We will be sure to purchase a couple of copies of your books for our Math for America library. Someday soon, we'll all be back at Math for America and check books out of the library for real. Thank you so much for your time. This has been such an exciting talk for so many of us, so we really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me. It was really fun.